Welcome to another boring topic. What links together a series of kids' films about being ninjas, a Godzilla-inspired film called Pulgasari, the eventual dictator of North Korea, and a famous director and his ex-wife? Let's start off this story in the early 1990s, when there was a short-lived series of movies called The Three Ninjas that followed the exploits of three boys who were trained to become ninjas by their grandfather and fought various bad guys in 4 films from 1992 to 1998. These films, surfing the tail end of the kids do martial arts craze kicked off by the Karate Kid franchise a decade earlier, were Three Ninjas Kick Back, Three Ninjas Knuckle Up, and Three Ninjas High Noon at Mega Mountain. All 4 films had different directors, but the most interesting story is found with Shin Sang-ok, who directed the 3rd installment, Three Ninjas Knuckle Up, under the name of Simon Sheen. And while directing a children's comedy, action martial arts film may have seemed like a bit of a come-down for a man once known as the Prince of South Korean cinema, it was undoubtedly a step up from being kidnapped by North Koreans and forced to make films for them with his ex-wife, who was one of the most famous South Korean actresses. How did one of South Korea's most famous directors wind up kidnapped in North Korea and making a Godzilla ripoff? And how did he go from being a prisoner in North Korea to making kids' movies in California? Let's go over some background on North Korea first, to set the stage a bit. North Korea, or as it is formerly known, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is one of the most enigmatic nations on the globe. Frequently referred to as the Hermit Kingdom, it has deliberately isolated itself from the global community, and mostly comes to notice in the news these days when it tests another nuclear device by exploding it inside a mountain, testing an ICBM by launching it over Japan, or for burdening each household with impossibly high quotas of human waste to turn over to the authorities for use as fertilizer. This, in a country without a single Taco Bell, is possibly the most onerous burden that its citizens suffer under, although they do at least have the consolation of the weirdly entertaining Moranbong Band, a North Korean K-pop band, to take their minds off of the stress of fulfilling their crap quota. A poor country, North Korea has a GDP of just $40 billion, or less than half the net worth of Jeff Bezos. In 1978, the second in command of North Korea was a man who absolutely loved cinema, especially Hollywood movies. Favorite actors included Sean Connery and Elizabeth Taylor, and favorite movies included franchises such as James Bond, Rambo, and Godzilla. This last one would become very relevant in a couple years. The man's name was Kim Jong-Il, and ever since 1974, he had been the designated successor of the dictator and founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. But from his 1974 designation as the successor, Kim Jong-il would have several decades of waiting before he would assume power and would need to find some way of passing the time. What to do? What kind of hobby could the eldest son of the most powerful man in North Korea take up to help the years pass by more quickly? Eventually, he decided to busy himself running North Korea's motion picture and arts division. All cinema in North Korea came under Kim Jong-il's control as he set to work overseeing North Korea's entire film industry. The film industry of North Korea was primarily concerned with cranking out patriotic films and stories to motivate, propagandize, and hopefully distract North Koreans from the poor quality of their lives. The quality of cinema turned out from Kim's directors and actors was simply not up to Kim's standards, however. From his extensive film library and the many hundreds of hours he had spent watching the best Hollywood films, he was confident that he knew what good acting, films, and stories looked like, but he just could not find a North Korean director capable of meeting his standards. The obvious thing to do was to look for new talent outside of North Korea, and the best way to do that was apparently to kidnap one of the most famous South Korean actresses and use her as bait to kidnap one of South Korea's most famous directors, who also happened to be her ex-husband. With some suitable re-education, the combined talents of a top actress and a top director would be just the shot in the arm that the North Korean film industry needed in order to fully flower into its full potential. Sounds like a bad soap opera, you say? Well, in this case, truth is indeed stranger than fiction, as in 1978, Kim Jong-il did indeed move forward with his plan, first luring famed South Korean actress Choi Eun-hee to Hong Kong, using the chance to direct a film in Hong Kong as bait. Upon arrival, she was lured to Repulse Bay in the southern part of Hong Kong, where she was kidnapped by North Korean agents and taken to North Korea, arriving in Nampo Harbor on January 22, 1978. 6 months after her disappearance, her ex-husband, Shin Sang-ok, while looking for her, was himself lured to Hong Kong, where he was also kidnapped and taken to North Korea. After several escape attempts, Shin was thrown into a North Korean prison. Several years of re-education later, Shin convinced Kim Jong-il that he had been fully converted and was willing to work for him. He and Choi were reunited on March 7, 1983. Shin formally began working on his first film for North Korea on October 20th, 1983, an adaptation of a story allegedly written by Kim Jong-il himself called An Emissary of No return. Over the next couple years, Shin directed multiple more films, frequently including scenes shot in countries all around the communist bloc, as Kim Jong-il wished for North Korean cinema to take on a more internationalist approach and make films with a broader appeal than just for domestic consumption. These films frequently featured Choi in a leading role, with both her and Shin throwing themselves into their craft and working to gain their captors' trust. Their films were shown all around the communist bloc countries in the mid-1980s, winning various awards, including a Best Actress award from the Moscow Film Festival for Choi for her performance in 1985's Salt as a woman in occupied Korea during the Japanese occupation. Concerned that they would be charged with deliberately going to North Korea should they ever manage to escape, Shin and Choi took the dangerous step of smuggling a tape recorder into various meetings with Kim Jong-il, managing to record, among other things, a conversation from October 19, 1983, where Kim Jong-il openly spoke about his actions in kidnapping both of them and his motivations for the act. At Kim Jong-il's insistence, they were also remarried while on a trip to Hungary. In 1985, Shin released what would be his best-known and also his final film from his time in North Korea, the giant monster film Pulgasari. This film took some inspiration for its monster from a Korean legend of a metal-eating monster called the Pulgasari, and was also heavily inspired by the 1984 film Return of Godzilla. Members of Japan's Toho Studios, the film studio behind Godzilla, even worked on Pulgasari's special effects after being tricked into coming to North Korea by being hired for a film being allegedly shot in China and boarding a plane that touched down in North Korea instead, something that undoubtedly came as a very unpleasant shock to them. After finishing production on Pulgasari, Shin and Choi were in Austria for a film festival, as well as seeking backers for the next film Kim Jong-il wanted Shin to make, a biographical film on Genghis Khan. Shin and Choi were still not allowed out without minders, and had multiple North Koreans guarding them and watching their every move. On March 12, 1986, Shin and Choi met with journalist Akira Inoki at their room in their Vienna hotel room at the Intercontinental Vienna. Managing to convince their North Korean handlers to leave the room, they were able to sneak down to the lobby and jump into a taxicab with Akira and race off towards the American embassy. Their North Korean handlers gave chase and were hot on their heels when the taxicab got stuck in traffic congestion. Fortunately, they were close enough that Shin and Choi were able to leap out of the vehicle and run into the embassy on foot. Granted political asylum, Shin and Choi were finally free of North Korea for good. Shin eventually moved to Los Angeles in the early 1990s, directing Three Ninjas Knuckle Up and working as executive producer for 2 more installments in the Three Ninjas series, Three Ninjas Kick Back and Three Ninjas High Noon at Mega Mountain. He eventually moved back to South Korea, where he continued work on various movie projects until he passed away in 2006. Choi returned to South Korea with Shin and lived there until her death on April 16, 2018. IMDb does not list any projects for her after 1985, but she remained a popular figure in South Korea and was widely mourned at her passing. Kim Jong-il finally took over as North Korea's leader upon his father's death in 1994, ruling as dictator until his own death on December 17, 2011. He remained an enormous lover of film, and by the end of his life had amassed a huge library of over 20,000 movies on VHS and DVD. And so ends the story of how North Korea kidnapped a director and his ex-wife and forced them to make movies together, culminating in the production of North Korea's Godzilla, Pulgasari. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing.